Hello everyone and welcome to City of Literature at Norfolk and Norwich Festival 2021. City of Literature is a Norfolk and Norwich Festival and National Centre for Writing presentation programmed by the National Centre for Writing. My name's Steph McKenna and I'm the Communications Manager at the National Centre for Writing. I want to thank you for joining us for this very special event in which we welcome Jessica J.Lee and Rowan Hisayo Buchanan, who will discuss their new commission, Looking Large and Small, part of the National Centre for Writing Open Doors series. Jessica and Rowan will be joined by Kellyanne Bradley. Very special thanks goes to Arts Council England, without whom this event would not have been possible. I hope you enjoy the event, and without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Kellyanne, Jessica and Rowan.
Hello everybody, and welcome to Behind Looking Large and Small. I'm Kellyanne Bradley, and as you've just heard, I'll be in conversation today with Jessica J.Lee and Rowan Hisayo Buchanan. Jessica is the winner of the 2020 Hilary Weston Writers' Prize for Nonfiction, the 2020 Boardman Tasker Award for Mountain Literature, and the 2019 RBC Taylor Emerging Writer Award. She's the author of Turning and Two Trees Make a Forest, and has a PhD in Environmental History and Aesthetics. She's also the founder of the Willowherb Review. Rowan is the author of Harmless Like You and Starling Days. Her work has won the Authors Club First Novel Award and a Betty Trask, and she's been shortlisted for the Costa Novel Award. Her illustrations have been featured by the Second Shelf Bookshop, Literary Consultancy, Catapult Magazine, and the Asian American Writers Workshop. Looking Large and Small is an online resource for observations, illustrations, and exercises exploring the natural world and our experiences of it. And I'd really like to open this conversation with a reading from it, so you have an idea of just how beautiful it is.
Thank you, Kellyanne. I'm going to read just a little bit from the first installment of the collection from Springtime. A too early spring. It is January when I see the first daffodils in bloom. Fountains of yellow on green spikes, tucked behind a terraced house wall. Some years, spring saunters in when usually, in the meteorological calendar at least, I'd expect there to be snow. But the flowers are a small joy. I begin to notice them each day while walking the dog to the park and back. Green is emerging in front of my house, too. I have only lived here a few months, so I wait, watching each day as the flowers inch their way above the soil. It is a tiny surprise. Crocuses and tulips. I do not yet know what color. The signs of spring arriving are easy to notice. Warming weather, the sun climbing into the sky sooner and staying aloft longer. Rain clouds tumble on the horizon, and green arrives in great bunches. I didn't learn to tell trees apart until my mid-20s. But I learned and loved the word catkins. Say it aloud and tell me it doesn't feel joyful in the mouth. In early spring, before the leaves burst, pollen-filled catkins, yellow-green spindles a few inches in length, dangle from the branch tips of so many trees. Alders, hazels, willows, and oaks. I'll stop there. There's lots of instructions in this, in each of the seasons, and so I don't want to read the instructions aloud, but it's a little taste of some of the writing.
Thank you so much. I really, really love that section, especially because of when you describe not knowing what colours the flowers are going to be. Because we're just in spring now, and the flowers are starting to come up. My emotional experience of nature has been very close to what you've been describing. To begin with, I'd like to know, how did this project come about? What was the inspiration behind it?
Rowan, can I? You had the original idea.
So I have known Jess for some time. We came to know each other basically through both being writers, as far as I can tell. We met, and very shortly after we met, she was like, let's go swimming in a German lake. And I thought I was going to die. But she's very lovely. And we continued to know each other after she swanned through the lake and I flapped and panicked. And I've always admired her work and her nature writing. So when I happened upon the prompt of Open Doors and the idea of creating a technological project using two different mediums, I knew that she was immediately the person I wanted to talk to. And I've done some illustration as well as being a writer. And so I sort of basically pitched it to her. I was like, hey, what if we did this? And I did the pictures and you did all the wise nature knowing, and then I could learn some things. And I did. I've only this year have I noticed that there are catkins on the street that I live on, because I was walking past and I was like, catkins, like Jess told me would happen. So yes.
I feel like I notice them now more though, because I've seen your illustrations, obviously, and I feel like I've spent so much time looking at the illustrations that now everywhere I go, I'm like, oh, these are like the catkins Rowan drew, and these ones are different, and I feel like I'm noticing them so much more.
I love that idea of like the chemistry of collaboration that between the two of you, you have been able to look large and small together. That's fabulous. How did the collaboration work? How did you choose the text, choose the illustrations?
Well, I will say on a practical level, we did a lot of chatting as we were developing the idea. Rowan and I are both lucky enough to have very lovely dogs in our lives, and our dogs are really good friends. And so we spent a lot of time just walking in the parks and discussing the project, just noticing what was in the parks, noticing the things that probably we could have really overlooked had we not just taken the time and had this structure to really think about paying attention to just, I don't know, even just the small, very overlooked details in the natural world where we live, which is, in the middle of the city in London. So yeah, I think a lot of the practicality was just sort of the day-to-day of us chatting. And then what did we do? I feel like we made a list of all of the possible things we could include at one point. And I just listed a bunch of potential phenomena. I didn't want to get too specific about this species or that species for the entirety, but think about, just leaves falling off trees, leaves coming into trees in the springtime, and birds migrating, and the way water freezes, like much more phenomena-based stuff. So I sent a list of those to Rowan, and Rowan picked the ones she most wanted to draw, really, I think.
But I have to say, you were generous enough to do the broader phenomena, but what I love about this project is someone like myself who really enjoys nature but may go, birds come. Do I know what birds? No, but they are pretty. You did give me examples, so you would be like, this phenomena, like mushrooms, and then you'd be like penny buns. And I would think, what is a penny bun? That's a very seductive name somehow. And sort of go and research and find pictures of penny buns to use as photographic reference. So you were very kind in giving me more specific prompts that I think, I hope future readers will enjoy that combination of openness and also individual pieces of knowledge that they may not have had at their own fingertips.
I very much felt like I was a recipient of a great deal of generosity, partly because, as you say, tracking phenomena rather than the exact flora and fauna of a very specific place, which I think could have shut some people out maybe. That was really wonderful. And also just those incredibly charismatic illustrations. There's one that really stuck with me that's of a grasshopper, and I looked at it and I was like, I love this grasshopper. This grasshopper's my friend. But I think before then I'd never really thought of grasshoppers as worth even looking at. Not something that I would consider an important part of nature, when of course every part of nature is an important part of nature. And this also occurred to me when I was thinking about the title, Looking Large and Small. I like the idea that you can look at a grand vista, you can look at, the sky and the stars and the patterns they make. You can also look at small details such as the turning of the leaves, the insects and the mushrooms. But I love the idea that there's a sense that you can look with curiosity or with a grandiose sense. How did you come up with that title?
Rowan, I think the title was you.
So I think I wanted to capture some sense that this wasn't this was going to be as much about you, the reader, and I guess me as the first reader of Jess's words, being in nature and the relationship you would have with it than just saying this is what nature is, that it would be about a verb. I think because when we were talking about it, it was a time when the great British public were being encouraged very much to go outside so that they would stay healthy. But if you wandered around London's parks in the winter, in the outside, it was lots of very unhappy, cold-looking people looking at their phones. And so we sort of were trying to think, okay, so what does it mean to be in nature? What does it mean to look at nature? So I think that's where the sort of looking came from. And I must admit, the first title was Big and Small, and then I liked how Large and Small both had A's in them, which required technical detail, of course.
The sensibility of a writer understands that these things are necessary.
Yeah, I feel like though it captures so much, because I think, I've spent a lot of time in my recent work thinking just about smallness in nature and about the things that are overlooked, and it was in these conversations with Rowan that somehow it really they very much came to life for me. And I think, I don't know, I really like the title for having that sort of playfulness. It feels like such a nice, simple title to me, but actually captures so much. Which also, to think back to, like how the collaboration worked, I feel like so much of this was done in these momentary glimpses and in these moments we spent together outside. And for me, at least, the biggest joy was that as Rowan was working on the illustrations, she would just like WhatsApp them to me every few days or every week. I would get like a whole bunch of new illustrations, and she'd be like, "What do you think of this? And what do you think of this?" And I was really behind. I hadn't started writing yet. And I was like, "Oh my gosh, these are amazing." But how do I put it? Like, it really captured that magic for me in these moments. It would be like this little image would pop up, and I'd be like, "Yes, this is what it's about." It was just that sort of that small act of looking interrupting my everyday life. Which I just adored.
I love that image of her just looking at the phone and seeing, oh, wonderful, nature is right here. And it's
penny buns and grasshoppers and yeah,
beautiful birds. Yeah, especially as you were saying, Rowan, I think certainly for the very cold parts of the lockdown, trying to be in nature and trying to go for our daily walks was sometimes felt almost like a grueling little task that we had to do for the sake of our mental health. And of course, although we are all so tired of thinking about it and hearing about it, we have been for a year in the middle of a pandemic, which has placed a great deal of restriction on our movements and our ability to choose where we're going and choose how we're going to interact with nature. Have you found that being in the lockdown changed the way that you were looking and changed the way that you were writing and drawing and thinking about creation and nature?
I think in my case, it was a real drawing inward. And I think this has been the case for a lot of other writers and just people more generally that I've spoken to, that I started noticing a lot more close to home. That, maybe I just hadn't really paid attention to before. For the first half of the pandemic, I was still living in Germany, and the thing that sort of crystallized it for me was the moment when I realized that for the 4 years I'd lived in my flat, I had thought there was one big tree outside my bedroom window. And then I looked closely at the beginning of the pandemic and realized it was two trees, two completely different trees from one another. It was like a chestnut tree and a birch. And I had never noticed, which for a nature writer is actually quite mortifying. But, I was spending my time writing about like mountains in other countries and botanical history and frozen lakes. And I hadn't written about what was outside my bedroom window. And then, I moved back to the UK in the autumn, just before Rowan and I started working on this in the winter. And those months for me were very much this process of like, we couldn't go anywhere, right? Like we moved back, quarantined for 2 weeks, and then like immediately after, like 5 days after we were released from the quarantine, we were back in lockdown. And so I was like, cool, welcome to my new neighborhood. I haven't seen any of it. My husband hasn't gone anywhere, like into town or anything. And we had many months of that. And I think, that meant that I got to know my local park really, really closely. And I got to know the patch of dirt in front of my house really, really closely. So I think it really and I don't think it was a bad thing. Like, that was not restrictive. That taught me to look in a different way, which is partly why I think especially the title Looking Large and Small is so evocative to me, because it really is that act, that verb of just looking more closely.
Yeah. Oh, that's... Sorry, I was just taken away by that story, and I was thinking about your book, which is Two Trees Make a Forest, and then thinking about like, oh, there's a forest outside your house. So sorry, my brain was just very excited to listen to you, and then I realized I too have to speak at this event. But I think during lockdown, my computer was my work, and it was also my play, and it was my friends, and everything in my entire life other than my dog and my partner lived in my computer. And I think drawing, even if I had to find photo reference, but the act of doing something with my hands, slowly, with attention, that I wasn't necessarily going to have to communicate immediately to anyone other than Jess, who would, like a delightful parent, say, well done, was very good for me, and good for my... I think it was good for my mental health. And I think saying, oh, being in nature, thinking about nature is good for your mental health is definitely one of those things that is said a lot, and I think is also sometimes misused, as in we don't need to budget for healthcare for these people because we'll just tell them to go in nature. Not so great. But setting that negative use of it aside, I think I felt it viscerally in a way where you're like, oh, this is a truism. Everyone has said this is true. It's amazing that looking at nature has made me feel better in my brain. Huh, no one told me that before. So, that was, I think, very, very helpful to me. And it did, it made me feel good about doing the project as well. Because I was like, I hope this can bring this to somebody else as well. And because there are some of the instructions that Jess mentioned, which she made sound very strict, but they're basically just suggestions for how to play in nature.
Well, this is the thing, as you say about truisms, the great difficulty of being told by numerous anonymous bodies, you must get out in nature, it is good for you. And I quite often had the experience where I was going and I was standing furiously with my arms folded in a field, just looking at a tree like, oh, look, it's a tree. That's good. Presumably I'm feeling better now. But then when I started reading Looking Large and Small, and I was reading the instructions, and I thought, actually, maybe it would have been helpful for me to have thought more curiously, to have felt more playful about what I was doing. I don't just have to stand here and passively take in nature and feel bad about the fact that I'm not doing it right or I'm not being moved properly. I think those instructions, those suggestions are very much inviting a kind of curiosity. And were they difficult to come up with or to integrate or to?
I think for me, at least, a lot of the instructions are just, they're taken from how I learned to look at nature. And I say this as someone who, like, I didn't grow up in a super nature loving household. Like, my mom loves houseplants, she loves gardening, but she's not like a wilderness person necessarily. No one really in my family is. And I didn't grow up spending a lot of time like learning the names of trees. I didn't learn the names of trees until I was in my mid-20s, and I taught myself. So I realized, because sort of in my teens, I started to really get excited about nature, but I didn't really know where to start. So I would read some books and whatever, but it was always on a much more sensory level, I guess, that I was engaging. It would be that I was like touching bark just to feel how different trees felt different, or without learning the names of them necessarily, or I was just sort of like enjoying the crunch of ice under my boots, and the different sounds that different kinds of snow would make. I grew up in Canada, so lots of snow. And so I think it was much more about those tiny ways of noticing that are not classificatory, that are not about putting a name on something and saying, this is what this is. And of course, that is a way of knowing. And we've included some details on those ways of knowing in the collection. But I wanted it to be a little bit more, I guess playful is the right word, right? To be able to say, can I just notice all of the trees on my street, and let's let's just like have a race, see which one drops all its leaves first, which one comes into leaf in the spring first. And just those tiny acts. And that was also partly because I wanted it to be really fluid in terms of where you could do it. Like, recognizing that not everybody is going to feel able to go out on a hike or into even their local park, and they might just be looking at nature from their windowsill. And there's actually just as much to look at, right? Like we can find that sort of richness and play on our daily commute or from our windowsill or, in our local park or in a country field. It really, it's about how we look.
Just to pick up on that idea of your mother not being a wilderness person and nature being something we can experience from a windowsill. We are using the word nature a lot because I think it's a very helpful shorthand for us. But the idea of nature writing, I think sometimes means a very different thing to a lot of people. I think it very often means, and has historically very often meant, the exploration of a wilderness, often by a white man, inevitably, being able to explore and name and seek out and be in enormous settings. I think that we're not using nature writing in that way in this conversation. I think it's much more capacious. And I wondered whether the two of you, did you have a kind of personal definition of nature or of the term nature writing?
Oh. I mean, I think, so the one thing I will say is that I think between Rowan and I, in the way that we sort of decided what would fall into the remit of what we were making, was very much like the stuff that excited us, that we enjoyed noticing, and that could happen in the city or it could happen elsewhere. And I think that was so shaped by the fact that like a lot of this, the sort of thinking around this happened like in central London in many ways, right? It happened in parks that we go to quite often that were full of people and cars and mud and our dogs running around. So I think there was that piece. And then, at least for me, in terms of nature writing, I think I tend to default to saying something like nature, place, and environment, because I like to sort of give people the options for how they might delimit that terrain, I guess. But that it could include all of these possible engagements. Like there's room for like the man to climb up the mountain and conquer it. There's room for that. Sort of. We've had a lot of it, but there's still room. And there's room for these more, I think, playful engagements. There's room for, I think, a greater range of people. I've done a lot of work, particularly in running the Willowherb, which is the space that this is now on, and the platform that's displaying this to readers and viewers. In terms of platforming writers of color in thinking about nature, place, and environment. And so I think for us, I just really liked the sort of gentleness of it being an invitation rather than saying like in a prescriptive way, this is how nature is experienced, this is how one must enjoy it. That, because I don't think that like, that's not the kind of writing I like to do, and it's not the kind of writing I like to read. But yeah, I don't know if I'm rambling a bit. What do you think, Rowan?
Something very odd happened to me because I don't think of myself as being a nature writer. I realized I have actually written multiple essays about trees at some point, including one for a political think tank on what is a British tree. So I was like, maybe I am a nature writer, but I didn't think I was one, definitely. And so I almost think of it as being a very intimidating category, not necessarily of the white men on mountains, but of brilliant people like Jess, and of scientists, and of people, that it would require years and years and years of study to be able to engage with. And I think there are people who have years and years and years of study and who bring that to their work. But I realized as we were talking and that I knew more than I thought I did when we began. I'm named after a tree. Like my dad is a man, and was weirdly obsessed with trees and nature. And we would go on walks and he would say, do you know what those two trees are doing? And I would be like, no. He'd be like, they're fighting to the death for the light. They'd be like, oh, okay. Very slowly, but to the death. You're like, okay, thanks, Dad. Thank you for that information. But you know, as much as I joke, like there was, you know, Jess said like, oh, we should do a thing about how to tell what sort of tree is from a tree, what sort of tree it is from its bark. And I went, that sounds magic. How on earth would I do that? And she went like, well, birch trees have white bark and then cherries. And I was like, oh yeah, I know that. And I realized that I think that, you know, I hope that this collection will bring new ideas to readers, that they might go, oh, I didn't know that that constellation was here in the summer. But equally, I hope that it tells them, hey, you may not know what all of the leaves are, but you know what an oak leaf looks like. You know what this leaf looks like, that you have a grounding, perhaps. And it might be different from my grounding or different from Jess's grounding, but that you can build on that you're not coming with nothing. You've been alive in this world, you've had your own environment, and it has given you a knowledge base. So, yeah.
I like the idea of just, it's enough to have been alive in the world and to know one leaf and to know one flower. That's permission enough. That's permission enough to be a nature. That's permission enough to engage with nature as you want it to be.
And even if you don't know the name of it, like even if you just find it beautiful, that is permission.
Absolutely. Oh, I love that idea. I feel much more warm towards the tree that I was glaring at so angrily in the middle of the field, which seemed my enemy and seemed to be chiding me. Actually, I think this is a nice opportunity to maybe talk about the Willowherb review a bit and what that's doing with nature writing.
Yeah. So I founded the Willowherb back in 2018, and it was partly due to this sort of real, I guess, a lack of a platform that was really intended to, I think, bolster the work of writers of color on nature, place, and environment, to go back to my usual phrasing. But I think part of it emerged out of, or following on many years in which we'd seen, particularly in broadsheets and in magazines, all of these think pieces about why there was such a lack of diversity in nature writing. And every single one of those pieces that I read pointed a lot of fingers at other writers who weren't doing a good enough job, but almost across the board failed to actually point to writers who were doing a good job and who were fighting their way into the genre, into the publishing space. And it really frustrated me. And as a writer myself, like that really frustrated me. And so, yeah, I thought, you know what, let's stop writing think pieces. Let's stop having arguments about this. And let's actually just literally put our money where our mouths are. And so I was on a train. My train was delayed. And I was stuck in this rail yard, and I was there for like 4 hours, and I was really stressed out and annoyed about this problem, having read another one of these things. And I looked out the window, and there was a bunch of rose bay willowherb growing in the rail yard, and I thought, oh, this is a plant I really love. I'd written about it a lot in my own work previously, because it's considered very much quite an offensive, invasive weed in Britain. Where I come from in Canada, it's native and in some cultures very celebrated. And I knew that it was a plant that would thrive with disturbance. It's a plant that, for example, after the Blitz, when they moved all the rubble and dug it into the ground on places like Hampstead Heath and in bits of East London, where I now live, after they planted it, I guess they'd also planted quite a lot of rose bay willowherb seeds, and it would flower up afterwards because it thrives after being burned and being moved around. So I that for me was just one of those moments where I was like, aha, a title for this thing I want to make. And so, yeah, I started a website and crowdfunded the space in 3 days. We had support for 2 years, which was really amazing. And now we're 3.5 years on from that. And we've had 3 full issues and a ton of collaborations, and have published, I think it's over 36 different writers from around the world on all sorts of things to do with nature and place, whether it's birds or migration or stories of language and naming and places lost and trees and all sorts of things. And I feel like it, for me, has really, to go back to that question of like what nature writing is, it has defined for me the pluralistic way that we can approach whatever we want nature writing to mean, that it can mean so many things. And at its core for me has underscored, I think on some level, the importance of recognizing that when we're speaking about land, we're automatically speaking about borders, we're speaking about, quite weighty, difficult things that I think very often have been erased from the nature writing space. I'm quite proud of the Willowherb actually. And so this is the first thing that I've actually written to put on the Willowherb space. And so I'm really grateful to have had the support to put this together. So, yeah.
I think the fact that it was crowdfunded so quickly and that there has been such incredible engagement with the issues does suggest there's a lot of hunger for these new perspectives, or these overlooked perspectives, that there are so many different ways you can look outside. There are so many different ways you can look at the land. There are so many different ways that you can think about place. And it's really very thrilling to see the Willowherb thriving as Willowherb does.
Thank you.
How do you, and of course, Looking Large and Small is on the Willowherb. Do you guys have an idea of who your ideal readers would be, or where they are?
So this is something, I feel like we talked about this a fair bit when we were working on it, because I kept having these moments where sometimes Rowan would be like, oh, you've written this like a children's book, or you've written this like it's for adults. And I kept jumping between the two voices. And at least for me, I realized partway through that I really wanted it to be quite open in a way that, this is something that can be read by adults, obviously, and should be read by adults. But also that, if a parent wanted to take their kid out and be like, hey, here are some fun instructions, let's go do them, that would also work. I really wanted it to be very open. And Rowan, when we pitched this originally, we had talked about geographically it being quite open, right? So it shouldn't be like, only if you live in the Southeast should this apply to you, and to only your local habitats and climate and ecology. We really wanted to sort of leave it very open in a sense.
Yeah, I think we have been, and I think on the flip side of that, I think it felt important to acknowledge where we were, that we weren't trying to speak for everywhere. It's done by seasons, and not everywhere has the same seasons we do. And so we're trying to strike this balance between being honest and specific about where we were, while at the same time saying, maybe you could think about how your environment is different than the one we just described, or that you may be noticing different leaves, or this may be happening in a different order, and that rather than feeling alienated by that, maybe you could begin to define your own climate and your own location in that way. And that, I think that felt really important. And, even in terms of microclimates, we were talking about when gorse blooms, because one of the illustrations is gorse. And Jess said, well, gorse blooms at this time. And I said, no, it doesn't. And she was like, what? And it's because my parents spend a lot of time in Scotland. They sort of live there partially. And up in the Highlands, gorse blooms quite a bit later than it blooms down south. So when we were saying, when does it bloom? We had to be a little bit open, even between ourselves. And actually, I made my poor mother take photographs of the gorse that was covered in snow. At the time, I was like, I need some photo reference. Can you go out in the snow? My mother is also not an outdoors person. She's a garden person. She's a managed outdoors person, not a field person. I was like, please go to the fields. Please. And then she sent me about 50 photos of slightly blurry gorse in the snow.
I loved this though, because we had this whole back and forth, and I was like, no, it can bloom as early as January, and sometimes it does. And we had this whole conversation, and then you were like, well, my parents have been out in the fields, and then sent a bunch of pictures. It was just I loved this idea of that, in doing this, we were somehow enrolling the whole world around us.
I'm very into the mental image of your mum tramping through the fields, looking for the gorse, furiously taking pictures of the gorse. I have to say, my own mother's relationship with nature is very much that she thinks it's a kind of free larder. She will go out into nature and she will see what she can eat, which, perfectly acceptable way to engage, I think, with the natural world, as long as you don't do it too often and don't over forage, which is always the danger, especially when my mother's concerned, since she is absolutely insatiable. Sorry, Mum.
I feel like maybe your mother should write for the Willowherb. Like, I want to learn how to forage insatiably.
She would probably just give you a list of all the things that she wants to see and she wants to eat, and she would kind of expect, as you do not with the instructions, the observations, the exercises, you expect a certain playfulness and a certain openness. My mother would not expect that. She would expect people to deliver some foraging produce to her door.
Well, we do have, there is a moment. There is a moment on foraging in the autumn section, because I wanted to call attention to the kind of looking that happens when you're doing foraging, or when you're just looking for something like mushrooms and different fungi, because at least for me, that really close attentive looking, where you're like on a very minute level looking for like that tiny patch of brown that looks a little different in amongst all the brown leaves, I get super, super dizzy. I mentioned like, take breaks because you might get dizzy. Because for me, like, there's the kind of looking, and I guess this again comes back to the title, that happens where I'm looking at something more broadly, or I'm looking at, a vista or at a scene, or I'm looking at a tree, and even that is, it's not that like really up close looking. But when you're foraging, there is a studiousness and a seriousness and a task at hand kind of attitude that goes into it. And that is also a very valid way of looking. It's one that I love doing, but like I find more exhausting than anything else. And I at one point I did a short certificate in field botany and field survey, and they had us go out and do like survey plots with in just like 1 meter squared, looking at all the grasses. And it's like, I will tell you, it doesn't seem like a large space until you get down on the ground and you're like, okay, is this grass different from this grass and this grass and this grass? Genuinely, that's the stuff where you've done it for an hour and you're like, oh, I'm really spent. Like, I'm ready for a long nap. And so it's amazing to me just like how that act of looking can be so engaging and so demanding.
I felt that because I have historically really struggled to tell the difference between a swift and a swallow, which also comes up in Looking Large and Small. And one of the problems is that I read the description on online somewhere or in a bird book, and then I immediately forget it. And if I see one fly past, is it a swift or a swallow? I don't know. I'll just freeze in one place and kind of stare, really desperately hoping that something will recur and I will be able to recognize it. I'm probably going to take Looking Large and Small on my phone out, so the next time they fly past, I can identify them. That was, I think, one of my favorite parts, because I thought, God, that's it. Someone has read my mind here. So someone knew that these are the birds I wanted to see. I know it's probably very, very difficult for you to choose, but do you each have a favorite section that you worked on, or a bit that's particularly dear to your heart?
Rowan, do you have a favorite one?
Oh, I don't know. I really like doing the swift and the swallow, because I also could not historically tell the difference. I mean, I can tell a swallow when it's like bright sunlight and has its red belly and like the blue, sure, but like when they're all sort of brown in the twilight, and I think, and Jess was like, they're very different. This is all the ways they're very different. And so then when I went to draw them, you have that feeling of when you learn something and then you're like, how did I ever not be able to tell the difference? But even though I spent 3 decades not knowing the difference, I was like, oh, these are completely different birds. And I think for me, that was really joyful. Also realizing that their tiny feet are so tiny that in all the reference photos, you cannot see them because they are so aerodynamic that they're actually pulled in really, really close. And so drawing them and being like, people are just going to think I forgot the feet. But I refrained from WhatsApping Jess to be like, please can we put, Rowan didn't forget the feet. They're just not visible. So I think that was for me one of the most fun parts. I also really liked drawing the summer constellations because I really want to be a constellation person. I want to be the person who you're walking with and who's like, oh, can you see, like, that's the dog, that's the rabbit, etc. And I am the person who's like, ooh, is that the Big Dipper or is that the Big Dipper? They're both squares. And so being able to like draw the summer constellations and sort of spend time thinking about that felt really good. And I guess for me, that's what a lot of the project hoped to do. It's to give you ways to spend time with something so that it sort of you can learn things without feeling the overwhelming panic of, am I getting this right or wrong? So yeah, I think those were some bits that were fun to draw.
Yeah. I mean, even thinking about, as you speak about swifts and swallows and all of the little ways of getting to grips with this knowledge, like, I feel like it's also important for me to say that, like, I'm not typically very good at telling things apart. I'm actually really, if you take me out into like nature and you're like, what's this? I'll be like, I don't know always. And that's, I write about this really often because it's about that process of learning. And I think when I've repeated something a certain number of times, when I've like drawn it for myself, when I've written it in my notebook, then maybe it'll stick. Usually I have to write like a whole essay about something before it sticks. And that's okay. And so I think probably the one that excited me the most was in winter. We wrote a bit about frost and then about mosses, which are like my favorite thing in the world. I really love mosses, and I'm really, really not good at telling mosses apart. I mean, to be fair, mosses are very hard to tell apart. They're very small, even for bryologists who study mosses for a living. Like, they need a lot of equipment, and they have to often like take mosses apart and put them under a microscope to fully identify them. That was one of the things I learned on my botany course, because I was hoping I would come out of it and be like, I've learned so many things about all of these plants I want to know. And it turns out all the ones I really want to know, like grasses and mosses, are mosses are not plants, but that's another story. But they're the hardest ones to know, right? Like, the tiny things are really, really hard to learn to tell apart. So it was just really fun to pick a few and to find ways of noticing them, I guess, in daily life. And, the one I always come back to, swan's neck thyme moss, which is in one of the illustrations, it's a moss that's, if you learn it, you will see it everywhere. And that's how I've learned it, because I learned it many years ago and then proceeded to see it everywhere I went. It grows on I was at Tottenham Hale Station waiting for a train the other day, and I was looking at the brick wall with like razor wire above it, and there was a lovely row of swan's neck thyme moss that was growing there. And I just thought, like, it's genuinely everywhere, and I really love that. So that was a really fun part to work on, and to get my strange obsession with moss into this project.
I was delighted to learn that.
Guilty.
Oh. Wait, why do you feel guilty?
It made you feel guilty?
Well, so I enjoyed drawing that moss because I remembered that moss. I was like, oh, I've seen that moss everywhere. I didn't know its name. And I realized the reason I have a very strong and visceral memory of it is I spent many, many hours as a child sitting in playgrounds and places, sort of picking that moss, sort of the way one would a scab off various surfaces. I now feel like a moss murderer. So thank you.
It probably was fine. Like, it probably just, wherever it landed, it was okay. And it went on to live a perfectly good mossy life.
Just a very powerful, resilient moss.
Yeah, you're just helping, spread the spores.
Yeah. Rowan, what you were saying earlier about wanting to be the person who can tell the constellations apart, so that when you're going on a walk, you can say, oh yes, there it is, the rabbit looking at the moon. I have a very, very similar desire to be that person with birds. I really want to say that's my very good friend, the chaffinch. That's my very good pal, the ringneck parakeet. And it does make me realise that one of the things that changes the way I experience nature and the way that I walk through nature is to be with someone else that you can share it with. And I wondered, has having dogs that are friends changed the way that you've been walking through nature?
We apologize to strangers a lot more.
Nature is sometimes a threat, as my dog is terrified of everything, and Jess's dog is very sweet and wants to put many things in his mouth. So I think we have a very direct relationship with nature.
Yeah, I feel like when we go out with the dogs, we're forced to confront things on a much more visceral level. Obviously, a lot of London clay made winter incredibly sticky. A lot of puppy bath time happened, at least in my household. Azuki, I feel like Rowan's dog got less dirty than mine. My dog is white and gets really thickly coated in mud because he likes to run around. But yeah, I feel like that visceral connection with just like telling my dog to drop all of the things he can't eat because he has a cleft palate, and like, yeah, watching them roll around together in the grass. And I feel like, so on a geological level, I have become much more conscious of every bit of every park we go to and how wet or dry the ground is in that particular spot.
No, I don't know that my dog is clean. My dog's just more of a jerk than your dog, because Jess's dog is filled with joy and like runs through the puddle filled with joy, and my dog walks around the puddle, or alternatively sits looking at the puddle and goes, "You don't expect me to walk through that, do you? Like, surely someone will now carry me through this puddle. I am too good for this park." I'm like, how? Where did you come from? You little jerk.
They're a good team, though. They have like a really good dynamic together, because my dog is not super social with other dogs, and so they'll run around together. And then at a certain point, Azuki really likes to invite other dogs to pay attention, and my dog Brisket really like. I feel like they have like a good, I don't know what the word is. Like, they like to meet other dogs, and then Brisket will be the protector. And then they'll like, Azuki will be the fun one who like zooms around, running circles around everyone. And they, I don't know, like they balance each other really well in a way.
My dog wants to smell all other dogs. But yeah, no dogs can smell her. And so then she runs behind Brisket or Jess and goes, "Protect me from this dog that wants to smell me after I smelled it."
She's got boundaries. I respect that.
Yeah. But yeah, it's a great joy to get them together.
I bet. And these walks are generally taking place in East London, I suppose, which is now where are you both based in East London?
In North London, we tend to meet. Yeah, Northeast we meet up. So across the Northeast, every park pretty much we do a rotation.
Yeah, we've done London Fields, Highfields, Hackney Downs, Hampstead Heath,
Hackney Marshes. Yeah, Lee Valley. Yeah, we're making the rounds.
One of the nice things about London, I say, of a city that I've lived in almost all my life, is that, so I have very little to compare, is that it is a very, very green space. I think there are quite a lot of green spaces for people to access and enjoy. And for your readers who have come to Looking Large and Small, and maybe don't have as quick an access to a garden or to a very large green public space, how would you encourage them to find and engage with nature?
So this was something I thought about a lot while we were working on this, particularly as I'm really, really lucky right now to live next to a huge amount of green space, but a very short distance away from me, there are stretches where it's very hard to find access to any park. Like even just like a tiny square it's just not available. And there's lots of big roads and big high rises and lots of new construction and rail yards. And so it was on my mind quite a lot as we were working on this. And the thing I kept coming back to was one of the buses that I take fairly often, the 56 bus, when it goes down one stretch of road in Hackney, there is a tiny seedling tree, a little birch tree, that is growing out of what is it? A lintel? What's the thing that's on top of a door? Like the thing that shelters the front door from rain. I don't know what it's called. I don't know architecture things. Whatever that part of a building is called, there's a little tiny one that's growing out of a house on a really, really busy road in Hackney. And I always see it if I sit upstairs on the bus on top of the double decker. And that for me is like, it's this tiny, tiny joy of something that shouldn't be growing where it is. Obviously, like it's going to have to stop at some point because that front door roof thingy is going to fall down. But it's been there for a really long time. You can tell it's been through at least a couple of seasons. It's pretty substantial. And that for me is just this great joy because I'm not sure if everyone else notices it. And it's genuinely something that's growing out of a piece of concrete that I see on the bus route down a road that is like full of traffic all the time. So I kept coming back to that image and thinking like, what are the small things that are visible like that everywhere I go?
I think that's really beautiful. I mean, the other thing that I would think about is, for me, I feel like I'm only just learning about the seasonality of food. And I think that that's, if you're able to, like, I shouldn't say like eating is nature writing, because the food writers will be angry. But I think, if clear, like, if you're growing spring onions in a cup in your kitchen, it's a houseplant. You can eat it. You're interacting with nature. If you are, if you have one of these little guys hanging out on your desk, being my buddy, you're interacting with nature, and that you can learn the histories of the plants that are available to you, that are visible to you. And looking large and small is very much about being outside. But if it's inside plants that are the only plants that are available to you, that's still nature. I mean, at the risk of sounding facetious, it's really easy to say like, these are humans and that is nature. And when you go forest bathing, that's nature. And when you're in your own weird cell-filled body, that's not nature. But nature, the annoying thing about it, as a term, is it's everything. It's everything. It's everything, and it's everywhere. So it's, I'm not saying you have to like find inner peace looking at the black mold in your bathroom, but I think there is almost always some way of connecting with the natural world. And I think, for me at least, it's not necessarily being in Kew Gardens and I love Kew Gardens. I love being in that space and being surrounded by plants from all over the world, and it's beautiful. But it's also, you can actually get as much from spending like time being really excited that you grew one daffodil bulb in a pot on your windowsill, because it's more about the intensity of your connection than the sort of vastness of the resource, to me at least.
Sorry, and I also want to say, on like, in the vein of looking large and small, Kellyanne, the tulips that are in the vase behind you have opened somewhat throughout this conversation. And I've noticed they're like, I can finally see the color, and I think it's really exciting.
I do find, well, first of all, I don't think it's at all facetious to say that, kind of nature is everywhere and we can engage with nature in so many ways. I love that as an idea that nature is as resilient as the moss. It can grow anywhere. We can find so many ways to engage with it and so many ways to like bring it into our lives, including having a bunch of tulips on a shelf behind us. Houseplants are incredibly frightening. I've never filmed any of mine in stop motion before, but I'd really like to, because you can leave one on a windowsill and walk off and come back later, and it's grown 2 inches, and also it's going for like your computer or whatever with one of its tendrils. I love to see a plant appear and to develop sentience. It's very unnerving. We are, as I've mentioned, we've been in lockdown, we've been stuck in one place. We've not really had very much of a chance to travel beyond our vistas. Are there any places that you are looking forward to looking large and small anew? any new places you might like to turn your attention?
Ooh. I feel like this is a tough one. I'm almost not allowing myself to dream of too many new places, but I'm definitely planning some like at home like in Britain journeys over the coming months. I think because my husband has never lived in Britain before, I'm really excited to take him to places, some of which I've been to before, and some of which I've never been to before, and show them to him together. I think that's really exciting. I would really like at some point later in the summer, I think, to spend some more time on the Welsh coast, because my dad's Welsh, and I feel like I've written an entire book about the country where my mother comes from, Taiwan, and I have not written anything about Wales really. Well, I've written a tiny bit about Wales, but not really a whole lot. And I would like to spend more time just enjoying being in that place. So I think that's somewhere on the horizon for me.
I think I'm not sure that I have been there. At the moment, I think I'm most looking to returning places rather than new ones. I think because it almost feels unimaginable new ones. But I think the big adventure in my life is that I have been trying. I am not green-fingered. I like to write about nature. I like to think at nature. I am not particularly good at growing nature, but I have just bought a tray of seedlings that were on discount, and I am excited to see if they live. I have realized that if I think of gardening less as something for which I am incredibly responsible and more like planned Hunger Games, clearly this is my dad's influence, then it's just exciting. It's just like, will you live or die? We'll find out. So that's what I'm excited for.
What are the seedlings?
Some marigolds and some lavender and some like weird apricot colored geraniums, which I don't know.
They'll be fine. They'll be fine. Geraniums are very hard to kill. Yeah, you'll be fine.
I'm not sure if I have enough sun for the marigolds, but
I believe in them. Come on, marigolds.
They were on sale. It'll be fine. Maybe.
I've had a very strange experience with planting plants, which is that it doesn't matter how much money I spend or don't spend. If I buy, a package of 99p seedlings from Wilco, they absolutely flourish. If I buy a very beautiful, expensive shrub and I push it in the ground and I take care of it and I talk to it every day, it dies after 2 weeks. It's allergic to tap water. It's allergic to my love. I really don't know what to do about that.
I feel like that's a very common feeling. I'm currently struggling with. I bought seeds to plant shiso, like perilla leaves, and I ordered some very fancy ones and experimented with them for a month, and nothing would germinate. And I looked it up on the internet. I looked up all different methods. I consulted with other people. No luck. And so now I'm running an experiment with some I bought from the refrigerator case from the Asian grocer by my house. And I'm really hoping they're going to prove more successful. But I feel like this is there is a level of experimentation involved. And very often it's not the fanciest thing that will thrive.
Such is life. My mother, the forager, the woman for whom food writing and nature writing is in fact one, grows a lot of mint, not just peppermint, but like fish cheek mint and Thai mint, because she uses a lot of it in her cooking, which for a very long time you couldn't really get in the UK, and it's nice for her to just be able to go out and pick those plants and put them in her food. And I think one of the things about looking large and small and about going out and owning nature and understanding nature and engaging nature is also a way of asserting your right to be in a place and asserting your right to feel ownership with that place. Not only, that you are allowed on the land and that you can walk the land and that you are not forbidden in this land, but also that I think you can receive the land, and the land is important to you as well.
I think that's really, it's at the heart of I think something that's really important to both of Rowan and I. I'm the child of two immigrants. I grew up in Canada, and I am British by my one parent who is British. I am also British, and came here and got to know nature relatively later in life. But I also think, like, for me, it was growing up in a Commonwealth country with one British parent at least and two Welsh grandparents. Like, there is that sort of infectiousness of British landscape that's like, I knew a lot about it before I came, in a way, just from storybooks. But I think there is that sort of, for me, I really liked this idea of there being a plurality of ways of knowing nature and enjoying nature. Like, you talk about your mum foraging, like, that is equally valid, I think. And I think particularly for communities who don't often see themselves represented in, like, a lot of our media and a lot of our sort of frames of reference and access for, like, what it means to engage with nature. I don't know. I really like the idea of us being able to assert, like, these small ways that work for us, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I like that way of looking at it. I think it allows, like, thinking about nature this way allows me to think about things I don't necessarily have the answer to, but that I find are those nuggets that you turn over and over again in your head. So, for example, we all know that the animals that were introduced to Australia had a very damaging effect on the Australian ecology, and that, you have to be very careful when you introduce new plants places. Equally, there are the people that my mother refers to as the tree Nazis, which, maybe not an appropriate way to refer to them, but are the people who upset her when they talk about how we only need British trees and British native species, and we have to support British native species. We have to pull out these non-native species, and she takes it very personally, and will triumphantly tell me that she has bought a Japanese tree and planted it in her garden in Scotland. And, like, she's winning in some way via the planting of this tree. And I guess the reason I bring this up is I was thinking about what you were saying about your mum, and how obviously including caring for the local ecology and not allowing something to invade and destroy the entire native environment, but the idea that when you plants might be part of what make a person feel at home or create an environment that has emotional resonance for them and is a way of relating to that landscape. So, in fact, my mother gave me for Valentine's Day, because she's very sweet, they gives me things for Valentine's Day in case no one else loves me, a small Japanese maple tree, so that I have it in a pot to be like, this is also, we have our Asian tree in this house. It is now covered in black aphid, so I have to save it. But yes, so I do think that there is a conversation that I do not know. I don't have the answers on how to balance ecological diversity with, or how to introduce new and interesting and beautiful plants without putting current plants at risk. But I do think that there are ways of talking about nature that can weirdly intersect with nationalism in a way that I find alarming. And it's one of the reasons I really appreciate the presence of the Willowherb and those more subtle ways of thinking about things. I don't know if that was an answer, but I hope it was.
It was a wonderful answer, and I think makes a lot of sense. I feel like identity is tied up in the idea of land, and land is tied up in the idea of nature. These things all intersect, and we can't escape them. Maybe we don't want to. So Looking Large and Small is going to be delighting and inspiring readers, I hope. What's next? What projects are next?
I theoretically should be writing another book, and instead I'm doing a lot of small things. I'm trying to write a children's book and Rowan and I are hoping to continue working together on some other projects. And yeah, I feel like we're just coming to the close on this, and it's still like early days on everything else. Rowan, have you got anything immediate lined up?
Other than the things I'm trying to trick Jess into working with me on, because I want to hang out with her and talk about plants and nature. I have a draft of a novel that I am so far too much of a coward to send my agent, but hopefully shortly after this airs or near or thereabouts, I will send to her. So, you know, there's that coming up for me. And then, yeah. But I'm one of my more abstract goals for myself is I would like to keep doing illustration work, because I am a novelist, and I used to say I would draw for fun, but the more illustration work I've been doing, and I've been doing it professionally on the side for a bit now, the more joy I found it brings me. So hopefully sending that out into the universe.
That's such a beautiful manifestation. I have to say that reading Looking Large and Small has made me want to go outside and look really, really carefully at the parts of the enormous Walthamstow marshes and the wetlands that I've lived so close to for so many years. And I just feel like they have more to give, and I have more to be curious about. And I really, really love that about what Looking Large and Small has given.
Thank you.
Well, in that case, thank you very, very much, Rowan and Jessica, for talking to me. This has been a really wonderful conversation, and it's felt very much like we have explored new possibilities, just as Looking Large and Small does. And I hope that the audience and your readers will also get the opportunity to explore more as well.
Thank you so much, Kellyanne.
Thank you.